how it all integrates in 30 seconds.
People have had a little bit more humility to recognize their limits and leave theology to people who study it.
Right.
They feel they have to express their opinions. Now, I have a lot more respect for them. I'm a scientist. I don't know anything about evolution. I don't know if there is or isn't. Who am I to speak? I'm teaching in one field. That's what I know anything about. And I have nothing really smart to say about anything else.
Right. Use principle arguments where they're just not going to do science.
Well, there's no argument science.
Well, there is if you can figure out how to start the universe on its own. Recognize that problem early on and free us from time. So it's not a substitute. He realizes that if there was true singularity, then there would have been no reason for it to change, absent something outside the system causing it to change. So his God is quantum gravity, which I think is kind of interesting because they haven't even worked out the theory of gravity and quantum.
Yeah, we have to get this going. Good morning. Welcome to our second class, an exercise in translation on the very first verse of Bereshis. I exhausted all my in the beginning jokes, so we're going to go straight to the discussion. But first, a few important notes about translation, because that's what we're going to be doing today. We're going to be translating the first word of the Torah. And whenever we deal with translation, especially a translation of the Torah, there are three pitfalls. Number one, translation of whatever language into whatever language is fraught with difficulty, because each language has its own idioms, each language has its own constructs, not to speak of grammar and syntax. So it's impossible to fully translate anything from one language to another and capture the true flavor of the original. That's true with any language, in any translation. Translation is a very, very, it's not enough to know both languages and to even understand them. It's an art and a science in and of itself. Maimonides wrote this to one of his disciples who was interested in translating his works, and he explains that in order to translate, you have to know both languages well, and you have to be able to transpose something from one language into the other. If you just translate things literally, then you're mistranslating it. You have to know how to put it into the second language and understand the concept well in both of the languages. It's a major challenge for any language. Secondly, Hebrew. Hebrew poses a completely different challenge apart from any other language that is translated, because Hebrew is not Hebrew. Hebrew is Lashon HaKodesh, the holy tongue. The meaning of the holy tongue. Why is Hebrew called a holy tongue? One of the reasons for it is because it's God's language. What does that mean when we say God's language? It means it's not language where words are made up simply because people decided to use a certain word. My son just mentioned to me the word nylon. Where does the word nylon come from? Nylon, because some of it was developed in New York and some in London. So Ny is New York and Lon is London. Is there anything in nylon that has anything to do with the word nylon? Absolutely nothing. But when you give a chemical formula, you say H2O, H2O tells you something about what water is. So we call water water. I don't know why we call it water. It has no real good reason, but H2O sounds a little bit more descriptive of what the water is. Well, Hebrew, every letter is a divine energy, a divine force. Animates that object that has that name. So if the name of an apple is tapuach and water is mayim, that is its very essence. That is what defines that particular object. It can't have any other name. One of the things about Adam, when he was created, God had him name all the animals, and the angels were stupefied. They said, how does he have the brilliance to know the names of the animals? You mean it's so brilliant to think of a name? I mean, everyone has a pet. They have a name for their pet. You think that they're brilliant because they know how to call their pet by a name? Because that name has no relevance, no meaning. Adam, when he looked at an animal, he saw its spiritual energy. He saw the life force behind it, and he knew the exact spiritually chemical name for that particular animal. And that's what made him unique, even as compared to angels. So when you take something from Hebrew, from Lashon HaKodesh, the Holy Tongue, and you try to translate it into another language, you have a major obstacle, because the Hebrew has so much more precision to it, so much more nuances of meaning. One Hebrew word could have multiple meanings, and all of those meanings might be accurate. Only some of them might be accurate. Some of them might be accurate in concert with the others. So it's almost impossible to translate something from Hebrew to another language. When you translate it, you have to always have that caveat. You have to always have that qualification that I'm not getting the entire story. I'm only getting part of it, if even that part is accurate, which is sometimes not even the case. Then there's a third pitfall with translation of the Bible, of the Torah. Unfortunately, this is true with any text where people have an agenda. When the Bible was translated into English by King James, there was an agenda. The agenda was to make the Bible reflect certain Christian values and certain Christian beliefs. Just to give you one example that I once read, if you look in the beginning of Genesis, the chapters, the way they're divided, are not the way they're divided in Jewish circles. We divide every section into 7 parts, and each one is called an aliyah. We call someone up to the Torah, they read one section. And very often it's striking that the way we divide the Torah is so different from the way it's divided up. I don't know if the King James Version was the first time they divided it up, but it really goes back to non-Jewish sources that divided the Torah into chapters. Chapter 3 in Genesis begins with the words, V'hanachash, and the serpent. That is the beginning of a chapter. In the Jewish division of sections, that's not the beginning of a chapter. It's in the middle of something. And there's a reason for that, because in Christological view, the serpent's role is very important. It highlights the original sin. In Judaism, the serpent is just a player, but he's not a major player. He's only God's instrument to cause Adam and Eve to fall, but he's not as if to say this is the highlight of Genesis. At any rate, that's just one small example. There are so many other examples. Yes?
Why do we use that differentiation in our English translations?
Once it was established hundreds of years ago, and when rabbis were called upon to debate the Christian clergy, they had to find some uniform way of communicating. So when they said chapter 5, verse 4, the rabbi had to know what chapter and verse his adversary was talking about. So Jews more or less adopted the division of the non-Jews, and we do follow the chapters and verses, but it's very interesting. Sometimes a weekly portion begins at verse 2. It shows you how there are 2 totally different ways of yes.
Is there something accessible in English that would show this section?
Yes, any copy of the Chumash, of the 5 books of Moses, has the division into aliyahs. Any respectable edition. So when you have all those 3 obstacles, translation of Hebrew, and a translation that is based on, to begin with, an agenda that is trying to make things look as if they fit into a certain belief system, then you have to recognize that you need to do a lot more research to figure out what the real meaning is. So with that introduction, let's go to the first word of the Torah, Bereshis, which they translate here as in the beginning. And this is the standard translation, but I'm going to show you that this is not the only translation. And just because there are different translations doesn't mean that any one is wrong and that one of them is the ultimate right one. There are different opinions and different approaches, and each one has a different message. And we have to remember, as I mentioned last week, that when you read a book and you want to take it seriously, you have to know its author and the reason the author wrote the book. So here we're told, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. That's the popular translation, and that's the translation given by Onkelos. Onkelos, if you read a sidebar, was a convert to Judaism, and he translated the Torah into Aramaic. To this day, Jewish law requires that every week we review the Torah portion twice with the Onkelos translation once. So every Friday on Shabbos morning, observant Jews will read the text of the Torah and the Onkelos translation. It shows you, number one, how much Judaism accords respect and honor to its converts, to sincere converts, that the most important translation of the Torah that is still in use today is Onkelos. Onkelos was a nephew of the emperor of Rome, of Hadrian, and there's a whole long story how he converted, but we're not going to go into that right now. But Onkelos received his teachings from Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yehoshua, who were the teachers of Rabbi Akiva. They were the students of Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, who was in turn a student of the famous Hillel. It just gives you a little bit of perspective when he lived. And his translation seems to follow the popular way it's translated. And in the beginning, God created heaven and earth. That's how Rabbi Sadia was a 9th century rabbi in Baghdad. He was the greatest Jewish leader of the time, great philosopher. In fact, he was the first Jewish philosopher. Until his time, Jewish philosophy was part of and integrated within Talmudic teachings, and he was the one who systemized Jewish philosophy. But he was also a great Bible commentator. He wrote his Bible commentary in Arabic, and he wrote other works of Jewish law as well. In his translation, he translates Bereshit as the same as the Hebrew word Barishona, in the beginning. And so does Nachmanides translate it. So we have pretty heavyweights, Jewish heavyweights, who translate it the way it's translated popularly. But what does this suggest when we take this translation? In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. So it sounds like it's saying, and this is how Rashi understands this approach, which Rashi disagrees with, but this is how he understands it, that the Torah is telling us the order of creation. That in the beginning, God started off with creating the heaven and then the earth. And then it continues to tell you the order of creation. Why is it important to know the order of creation? So, one could say very simply, it's to teach us the importance of order. Remember, the Torah was written by God, and it was here to teach us something about our lives. Well, if the Torah is out to tell you the order of creation, that means it's trying to tell us that, number one, we should do things in an orderly way, in a systematic way. And that everything that happens in the world follows a system. That the fact that the world was a world of chaos, and then it became a world of order, and then there's a Torah that was given, and then the Jews got into their land and had a land of Israel, and they built a temple. Everything is part of an order. God, as Einstein once said, doesn't play dice with his universe. There is a system, there is a plan, there's a purpose. So even this very simple translation conveys an important message, the importance of order. More specifically, it says that God first created heaven and then earth. In another lecture, when we talk about the end of the verse, I'll go into the dispute between the school of Shammai and the school of Hillel. Those who are the other class remember the dispute how to light Hanukkah candles. Well, the same two sages argued, schools of sages argued about which did God create first, the heaven or the earth. Well, from this verse, it seems that the heaven came first. So from a certain perspective, we're supposed to look at this and say that the way we look at things is that heavenly things come before earthly things. This is to give predominance and preeminence to the soul, the spiritual, before the physical. The school of Hillel has a different opinion, but we'll get to that when we get to the end of this verse. So this is just a simple translation of the text, but even the simple translation is pregnant with meaning and relevance to our lives. What I just said now is just one possible way of explaining the message and the relevance of that verse, but by no means does it exhaust all possible lessons. And every person has a right, as long as they use the text properly, with integrity, and with common sense, to find their own understanding of the text. In fact, the Zohar says that everyone is obligated to find new meanings when they study Torah. That whatever Torah you study, this could be the 5 books of Moses, it could be the prophets, it could be the Talmud, a Jew is obligated, just as he's obligated to study Torah, a Jew is obligated to find new meaning in it. Now, I have to be very careful when I say new meaning. New meaning doesn't mean that I could say light means dark, day is night, and night is day, and good is evil, and evil is good. That's new. Well, it's not really new, but it might be new to some people. No, it's not a license to make up anything you want. Shabbos is Tuesday, not Saturday. No, that's a distortion. But within the framework of Torah, every person has a place where they could try to find some new meaning. And I'm only mentioning that because I just gave you one possible lesson that we can learn from the order in which the Torah tells us God created the world. It tells us that we should do things in an orderly way, that God runs this world in an orderly way, even though we don't always see it. Sometimes it seems the other way around. Sometimes it seems that things are going backward. But we have to know that there's an order. God is not doing things haphazardly. And that we should have the right orders, heaven before earth. Now we go to, before I go further, there's an alternative way of understanding this translation. There's a commentary on the Onkelos translation. And he says that this verse is there to tell us that in the beginning, God created two substances that form the basis of all other creation. That we should know that creation did not materialize by just one declaration. God said, let there be a universe. No. God first created, and this is what Nachmanides actually says, a substance which the Greeks call the hylic substance. H-Y-L-I-C, I think. L-E-C, I'm not sure. That's some type of a primordial substance that has no form. It's just substance, matter without form. And that's the basis of all existence. And this commentary explains that that's what Onkelos really means by this translation. In the beginning, God created a substance from which heaven meaning here all of the universe besides the earth, and a substance from which the earth emerges. But these substances themselves have no form and have no definition. So the Torah is trying to tell us that creation happened in two stages. First is a stage of creation of substance, of matter, and then is a creation of form. Yes?
Didn't Rashi suggest that the word Shamayim is made up of two words?
We're not up to Shemayim yet. Remember, this is a 6-week class on the first verse. Shemayim is at the end of the verse. We have a long way to go. Yes?
When it says Sahara, are we talking only about planet Earth or all the planets?
Yes.
Yes, to both.
Yes, to both. When we say Shemayim, heaven, are we talking about the sky up there? Talking about the universe? Talking about the spiritual worlds? Yes. Okay. We'll get into that when we get to that, yes.
As long as we're on it, for some reason recently, Reform rabbis are liking to argue that the first word means that God didn't really create the universe, that it was always here, and God just worked with what was around, which I find ironic because the steady state theory has been abandoned by science, but apparently the Reform movement wants to go back to it. But, you aware of that, Mike?
I'm not aware of that, and I'm surprised that there's such an attempt to distort the simple meaning of the text. Maimonides, in fact, when he deals with this theory that the Greeks had, that the world always existed, the universe always existed, coexisted with God, different views of Plato and Aristotle, but they all agreed that there was some type of existence that was always here. Maimonides says, though he couldn't disprove their theories philosophically, he says you can't prove them either, and therefore we go by the simple understanding of the text that God created the world, that the world is not a kadmon, it's not here, it was not always here, and that's one of the 13 principles of faith, to believe that the world is created, and it's based on this very first verse. There's no one who distorts the verse that I've ever heard, but I'm not surprised that someone will come along and distort it, because people distort everything. Yes.
Well, I know we talked about it a lot last week, but I still don't have a handle, and this gentleman's question brings it up again. Where does the word Reshit come from? What does it actually mean? We have this definition that,
Okay.
you're telling us comes from some Roman guy. What is the origin of the word?
Well, the word
What is it?
the word Reshit is used multiple times in the Torah, and wherever it's used, it indicates something that is the first. If you look at the word Reshit, what is the root of the word? Rosh, head. So it indicates something that is at the head of something else. However, in Hebrew, there are two different words that have the same basic structure: Reshit and Rishon. Rishon also has the word Rosh in it. So Onkelos, Sadia, translate Bereshit as Barishona, which means in the beginning. However, we'll soon see Rashi has a totally different way of translating it, as well as Ibn Ezra and others. So let's go to part number 2. This is the way Rashi explains it. Now Rashi has 2 explanations. I'm giving you his second explanation first, because his second explanation is more in line with what people would say is the simple meaning of the text. This is how Rashi translates it. Not in the beginning God created heaven and earth, because Rashi argues that it's not in the beginning, it's in the beginning of. In the beginning of God's creation of the heavens and the earth, and I would take out the word now, and I would just substitute the word and. It's a run-on sentence. And the earth was astonishingly empty, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the water. Then God said, not and, then God said, let there be light, and there was light. That's probably how, Rashi doesn't give you the continuation, but you have to assume that that's how he's translating it. In other words, what Rashi is saying is, number one, grammatically, it's not precise to say that Bereshis means in the beginning. Grammatically, it should be in the beginning of.
Which is a construct.
Right, it's a construct. And that what is the text trying to tell us? That in the beginning of God's creation of heavens and earth, when everything was dark and desolate, then God said, let there be light. So what is Rashi telling us about this text? Very simply, he's telling us that the Torah is not interested in teaching us which came first, heaven or earth. It's not even interested in telling us anything about the way the world existed initially. It's interested in telling us that the first thing that God said was, let there be light. That's the first thing. Because it was dark and chaotic, God wanted there to be light. That's how Rashi would translate it. You have the whole text of Rashi on page 4. But Rashi says, if you wish to explain it according to its simple meaning, explain it thus. At the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, the earth was astonishing with emptiness and darkness, and God said, let there be light. Okay, you could put in the word and or then. The idea is that it's really not one verse that ends with the words heaven and earth. It continues. It's a long verse. It's several verses, but it's really one long sentence that concludes with, and God said, let there be light. And Rashi argues that against the other interpretation. But Scripture did not come to teach the sequence of the creation, to say that these came first, which is the Unclus translation. For if it came to teach this, it should have written the Rishona, which is more accurately descriptive of order of things. He created the heavens and the earth. For there is no ratius in Scripture that is not connected to the following word. It's always in the construct state. And he gives, I don't want to go through every line of this because it's going to become a little boring with the proofs that he has, but he cites several examples where the word ratius always means beginning of, never just in the beginning. It's the beginning of something, in the beginning of something. Not this is the beginning, but in the beginning of this process, he said, let there be light. And then at the end of the Rashi, which you can read on your own, Rashi disproves the argument. Well, we can read that part in the second paragraph. We'll read it. If so, if you say that Scripture indicates the order of creation, be astounded at yourself. For the water preceded, as it is written, and the Spirit of God hovered over the face of the water. And Scripture did not yet disclose when the creation of water took place. In other words, in the first verse it says, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. Well, that means if you take that literally, that the first thing that was created was heaven. But water existed even before, because in the next verse it says, and the darkness was on the face of the deep. The Spirit of God hovered over the face of the waters. That means there was water there before. And when did water get created? Nowhere does it say that God said, let there be water, so we have to assume it was there. Yes?
Yeah, do we know that really means literal water? I mean, the story that
Whatever it means, it's irrelevant. Whatever water means, water was there before the heavens and the earth. So the Torah could not possibly be saying that whatever heavens and earth means came before water, because water was there before. Moreover, Rashi says, the word heaven in Hebrew means water. Shamayim, or Eshmayim, fire and water. That means fire and water existed before the Shamayim, which we translate as heavens, which is an imprecise translation, of course. It's a limited translation. So Rashi therefore concludes that Scripture did not teach us anything about the sequence of the earlier and the later. Rashi negates that because Rashi is of the opinion that the word ratius, it's just a grammatical matter, cannot possibly be beginning without the word of, the beginning of something. And then Rashi also refutes the idea that Shamayim, which we translate as heavens, was actually there first before water and before fire. But now we have to look at Rashi's interpretation from another angle. According to Rashi, what is the Torah trying to tell us over here? Remember, this is not a storybook. This is not just about cosmology. The Torah is not a book of cosmology. It's not a history book. It's not there to teach us science, though you might be able to glean some things in those areas from the Torah. That's not its objective. Its objective is Torah, which, again, is another word that's been so mistranslated. How do they usually translate the word Torah? Law. Torah doesn't mean law. it has laws in it, but Torah means guidance, instruction, direction, and maybe a half a dozen other words. The last word I would think of, if someone told me, you better find as many translations to the word Torah if you want to get out of this room alive. And I would have to write down as many translations. If I hadn't known that it had been mistranslated as law, I don't think it would even enter my mind to use the word law as a translation of Torah. I would find a half a dozen other words, not law. And that caused a lot of problems, I think, for Jewish people, because law is a boring, dry, sterile thing. Unless you're a lawyer and you enjoy it. Most people do it for a living, but law takes away, strips it of its grandeur, of its spirituality, of its beauty, of its message. Yes.
Actually, a number of Christian sects criticize Judaism because of that mistranslation.
Yes. Yes. That's all it is. It's rules. But Torah doesn't mean rules. Torah means a path in life, a direction. It also has related to it the word light. It's there to illuminate our lives. That's why I mentioned last week that the Aramaic translation is more explicit. Oraisa means introducing light. Torah is a source of light. But at any rate, if Torah is light, if Torah is there to teach us how to live our lives, what is the purpose of knowing that in the beginning of the creation of the heavens and the earth was dark and desolate and void, God said, let there be light? Yes?
The importance of light.
The importance of light, obviously. That whatever else existed, that's only secondary. That's tertiary. That's not really the goal, the objective of the Torah's story here. The Torah's story is to tell you that the very first thing that God said, God's first words, are let there be light. There are no other words mentioned in the Torah before that in terms of what God said. God said, let there be light. Why is that so important? Question number one. Now, question number two, light is needed so that people don't trip, that people see where they're going. There were no people around in day one. There were no animals around day one. There was no plant life day one. You didn't need light day one. So why did God create light right in the beginning, before everything else? And also, what kind of a light was it? The sun was not created until day 4. So what kind of light was it? Okay. I'll explain. Light, number one, is the very goal and objective of creation. That's what the Torah is saying at the very outset. Before you build a structure, before you develop whatever it is you have planned, an ambition that you have for the future, the first thing that you have to articulate is what is the goal, what's the objective. If you build a hospital, you don't just build a hospital and say, well, what can we do with this building? Oh, let's make it into a hospital? No. You start off with the objective that you want to heal people. That's the first thought that enters your mind. Not the bricks, not the mortar, not the steel, not the fixtures. What enters your mind is the idea of healing. If you build a school, what do you have in mind? Not the classrooms, but I want to educate people. Education is the first thing that enters your mind. When God creates a world, what entered the divine mind? What is my goal? What is my objective? Let there be light. I want light here. I want a world that reflects the source of light. God is the source of light. I want this world to be a reflection of that source of light. Because on its own, the world will be dark. The world God put into his plan would be a dark world, a corrupt world even, a chaotic world. And the goal is that we, through our actions, which are associated with the teachings of the Torah, which are likened to light, those actions will help to generate or regenerate the light that was there at the very beginning. Now, as far as the question, what kind of light was it, our sages tell us in the Midrash and in the Talmud that that light was not sunlight. It was a primordial form of light. It's a spiritual type of light that if you had access to it, you could see from one end of the world to the other. It could mean literally so, that it was a type of light, just like we have the ability to see from one end of the world to the other with Skype, with television, with computers. It's not so far-fetched to believe that God has even more sophisticated ways of enabling us to see from one end of the world to the other. But that's the minor part of it. The major part of it is that this light was truly illuminating, because when we talk about light, it's dark in the room, someone turns on the lights, it's very limited what you really see. People can only see the present. You don't know the past or the future. You only see one dimension of things, the things that meet the eye, and if you're smart, you can go a little bit beneath the surface and figure out a few more things, but you cannot really plunge to the depths of what it is that you're experiencing. You can't fathom the real secrets of what is it that you're seeing. So light that we have is very limited. It's limited in terms of the scene that you see. You only see one dimension of it. You only see one phase of it. And you can't see the subtext, the context. You just see the text. That's all you see. The light that we had the first day of creation, which is the ultimate light that God concealed, and I'll soon talk about that, is the light that enables people to see reality the way it really is. When you see reality, you see every dimension, you see every part of it, you see things in context. Now, the famous analogy, someone is brought into a room blindfolded, and he sees masked people with knives in their hands approaching some person who's confined to a stretcher, and you think that these are a bunch of murderers ready to kill the person, and you discover, of course, it's an operating room, and these are surgeons ready to perform life-saving surgery. What was the problem with that person? Was his eyesight not good enough? He has 20/20 vision. He sees as well as anyone else. The problem is he doesn't have the context. He only sees one slice of it. If you see the whole movie at once, you don't have any suspense. You know the whole story already. Well, that light enables you to see the whole story. And that's the goal. That's God's goal. But how do we reach that goal? It says God didn't want that light around, because if wicked people had access to it, they would use that. It would be a field day for a thief. He would know exactly where you keep your money, where you keep your gold, where you keep your jewelry. He wouldn't have to search for it, and he would rob everyone clean. So God doesn't want people to see everything. And of course, that's a literal version of why God doesn't want us to see everything. If we would see the whole picture, we wouldn't have any challenges. God wants us to be blind, partially blind. And through the Torah that we study, it gradually begins to expand our horizon, our view. We have a more panoramic view of life, and we see things more deeply. And incidentally, Hanukkah, we're told, is the miracle in which that original light was reintroduced into the world. That Hanukkah lights help us see the world in a totally different light. So God created that light at the very beginning, and he hid it. Where did he hide it? In the Torah. So that ultimately, in the Messianic age, that light will be fully revealed. Right now, you get it through the Torah. There's a story told of the Baal Shem Tov, that a woman came to him and cried to him bitter tears that her husband disappeared. She doesn't know where her husband is. In those days, people would travel and wander, and he wouldn't know where they ended up. And she was stuck. She didn't know if her husband was dead or alive. So she comes to the Baal Shem Tov. Baal Shem Tov was known for his divine inspiration, for his prophetic abilities, for his clairvoyance, for his all spiritual powers. And she comes to the Baal Shem Tov, and the Baal Shem Tov opens up a book called the Zohar, and he looks in it, and he tells her, your husband is in this town, in this place. And then she goes there, and she finds her husband, and she's reunited with him. And the question has been asked, if the Baal Shem Tov had this ability to know where people are without seeing them physically, why did he have to open up the Zohar and look there? And the answer is that what the Baal Shem Tov was doing was accessing that original light that enables you to see things from a completely different vantage point, where you can literally see things that are hidden from others. But where is that light? That light comes from the Torah. And specifically, the Zohar, the word Zohar actually means light. So he found it in that source of light. Okay, let's go on to the next interpretation. So far we have two. Number one is, in the beginning God created heaven and earth. It's to tell us the order of creation. Number one. Number two is, in the beginning of the creation of heaven and earth, God said, let there be light, to tell us what God's main purpose of creation was. Now we have a third one, which is actually Rashi's first explanation. In the beginning, and this is on page 7, in the beginning of God's creation of, Rashi says, this word, in Hebrew, this verse calls for a midrashic interpretation. What does Rashi mean by that? Very often, although Rashi committed himself to giving us the simple level of interpretation, remember we said there were 4 levels. The first level is pshat, the simple, surface, straightforward level, which is not always literal, but it's still the simple level. Rashi acknowledges that sometimes the best explanation requires a tinge of midrashic, the third level, where you probe beneath the surface. Sometimes you're compelled to conclude that the Torah has a subtext, and that's the simple meaning of the text. Again, I gave you the example last week. If someone tells you that person has a heart of gold, you don't rush them to the emergency room and have a cardiologist make sure that they're not dying because their heart turned from flesh to gold. You know that it simply means that they're a kind person. That's the simple meaning, even though it's not the literal meaning. Sometimes you're forced to say that there's a little bit of a deeper meaning that forms the basic meaning. And here's one example of this. Rashi says that the word bereshis, it teaches us that the sequence of the creation as written is impossible. As it's written, okay, now that should be in brackets. That's not part of Rashi. As the part it teaches us is not part of Rashi. Right. This verse calls for a midrashic interpretation, as our rabbi stated, that for the sake of the Torah, which is called the beginning of his way in the book of Proverbs, and for the sake of Israel, who are called the first of his grain. In these two biblical texts, Proverbs and Jeremiah, the word rashis, which means beginning, is used to describe Torah and Israel. Torah, we know what Torah is, and Israel refers here to the Jewish people. Sometimes Israel refers to the land, so in this context it refers to the people. That the Jewish people are referred to as God's, the first of his grain, and the Torah is referred to the first or the beginning of his way. And that's what the word bereshis means. The prefix, be, has several ways of translating it. Be could mean in, as in the beginning. Be can mean also because of. It's a very short way of saying because. Bereshis means because of Rashis, God created heaven and earth. The Torah starts off by telling you why God created the world. What was his objective? That his objective, the purpose of the world, was for this union between Torah and Israel, which on the surface one could say sounds very chauvinistic, that we're saying that the world was created for us. The Talmud says that why did God create one human being and many animals? Because God wanted us to say the world was created for me, just for me. What does that mean? The world was created for me? You mean, oh, I'm the only one who's important? It says everyone is obligated to say that. So I want you all to know that everything in this world is for me. There are people who actually believe that. They act as if everything is theirs. There was one great Hasidic rabbi who said that you have to always carry these two sayings in your pocket. In one pocket you carry, the world was created because of me. In the other pocket you carry the verse, and I am but dust and ashes. They're not conflicting teachings. What it means when we say, because of me the world was created, it means I see my purpose in this world is to help the whole world. In fact, the word world in Hebrew, olam, relates to a word in Hebrew that means concealed, helem. That why did God create a world in which truth, reality, light, godliness is hidden? It's because he wanted me to change that. I have the full responsibility to save the whole world. Everyone has to say that. Most people would probably rather not have to say that. It's not chauvinistic at all. What it's saying is that I sense that I have the greatest responsibility, and I can't shirk that responsibility or pass it on to someone else. Yes? That's part of it, yeah, sure. God created concealment. It's his creation, but he created it so it should be undone. And he said, I want you to feel that you're the one who has the responsibility to undo it. Well, who is charged with that responsibility and has a harder time passing the buck? The Jewish people. They were given this responsibility, and they have suffered more than any other nation on earth, sometimes inexplicably. We're not going to try to justify it, but sometimes, as the Torah says, it's because we forgot who we are and what our mission is and what our role in this world is, to change the world and to make it a godly world, to take away the concealment. So the Torah tells us that why did God create the world? Not just for Torah, not just for Israel, but for the two coming together, the Jewish people implementing the Torah into society, into this world. That even though there are a multitude of nations, and they all have responsibilities that were given to them by God, summed up by the 7 Noahide commandments, to whom did God entrust the responsibility to make these known to the rest of the world, and to inspire the rest of the world, to be a light to the nations, to use a biblical term? It was Israel. And we do it through the Torah. Even the 7 Noahide commandments come out of the Torah. They're not a separate text that is separate from the Torah. They're all part of the Torah. That is our responsibility as Jews to promote to the whole world. Yes?
Rabbi, because there are no vowels in the Torah, what would the word ba reshi mean if you put instead of fifth ba? How do we know it's a fifth?
Okay. It reminded me of a story that I forgot to tell before. The Talmud records a series of stories with Hillel, the sage Hillel, who was had to convert a few people. One of them comes to Shammai, Hillel's colleague, who was known as a stern, tough, rigid disciplinarian, and he says to him, I want you to convert me the whole Torah, but I only want the written Torah. I don't like this oral Torah business. And Shammai gave him the boot. He chased him out. He says, the Torah is made up of 2 parts. There's a written and there's an oral. You don't like it, you can leave. He comes to Hillel. Hillel welcomes him, and Hillel starts teaching him. This is an Aleph. This is a Beis. This is a Gimel. This is a Daled. And he's very happy. He's learning. Comes the next day, and Hillel says, he points to the Tuf, the last letter, says, this is an Aleph. Shin, he says, this is a Beis. He said, 1 second, yesterday you told me the opposite. He says, why do you trust me? How do you know that what I'm telling you is true? It's because there's an oral tradition that was passed down that we have, that this is an Aleph, this is a Beis. If you don't accept that oral tradition, there's no way you could read Hebrew or the Torah. Well, trust me that the oral teachings were likewise passed down from one generation to another. Okay. So, we have Rashi's preferred explanation, actually, that the word Bereshis does not mean in the beginning or in the beginning of, but because of the beginning. In other words, there are certain elements that form the very purpose of creation and the instruments through which God's plan comes to fruition. Then we go to translation number 4. In the tradition of translating the Torah to different languages, there are all sorts of translations. There's a translation into Greek. I mentioned this in an earlier class, the Septuagint, which the Talmud says was a tragic translation because the rabbis who were forced into translating the Torah into Greek had to change things deliberately, change the meaning of the words so they shouldn't offend King Ptolemy. And the Talmud says that this was a very difficult day for the Jewish people. It was similar to the day in which the golden calf was built. It was so tragic because it led to the distortion of the Torah, even though it was done by great people, by great rabbis. And we'll talk more about that in another class. But that was a tragic translation. Unclus, on the other hand, was considered to be a divinely inspired translation that we still use to this day. Maimonides extols the virtue of Unclus because of one major feature of Unclus. Unclus was very careful to translate anthropomorphic terms in a way that it should not compromise our belief in God as not being a physical being. For example, when the Torah says, and God descended, Unclus translates it, and God revealed himself. So he's very careful to adjust the translation so that you should not ascribe physical properties to God. So Unclus is known as a very reliable translation, but he's very, very straightforward. Just translates things word for word. Then there's two other translations into Aramaic. One is called Targum Yonasan, and one is called Targum Yerushalmi. These are different Talmudic period translations of the Torah into Aramaic, and they are not as literal as Unclus, but they are nevertheless classic translations. The Targum Yerushalmi translates the word Bereshis a third way, the prefix. Remember we had Bir means in the beginning or because of the beginning. Now we have a third translation. Bereshis means with the beginning, God created heaven and earth. What does that mean? With the beginning. So he says it means bechuchmasa, with wisdom, God created heaven and earth. The simple meaning of that is that when you look at creation, you see incredible wisdom. When any person who sees creation, especially if you're a scientist, you see the marvel of creation. You see the grandeur. You see the beauty. You see the precision. You see the complexity. You see the cohesiveness. You see all of creation being something so remarkable. You look at every aspect of creation. You look at a single cell, and you see a universe that is so beautiful and so grandiose. So you see God's wisdom in creation. That's a simple, straightforward understanding of that. But there seems to be a deeper understanding of that. When God creates the world, this is the way the Kabbalists understand this. When God created the world, God articulated, if you will, 10 different powers. They're known in Hebrew as the Sephiros, or Sephirot, if you want to use the Sephardic pronunciation. These are 10 divine instruments through which God manifests himself in this world. The highest, the first, Rashis, the first divine instrument which we have a parallel of in our own personality is Chachma. Chachma is translated as wisdom, but it doesn't mean wisdom as much as it means the first stage of intellectual development that hovers between beyond intellect and intellect. There's a point where, let's say you're studying a subject and you're using your analytical powers, and then all of a sudden you have this eureka moment and you see the answer to the question. Is that an intellectual experience? Yes and no. It's partly intellectual, it's partly a revelation. Sometimes you just see something. You can't articulate it, you can't explain it. Why can't you? Because it's the first part of your soul that is not within your soul. It's a little bit of an expression, an extension of your soul going outside of yourself. The very first power that a human being has is this ability to conceive of a new idea, which again, it's conception of an idea, but it's not yet in the realm of true understanding. So it mediates between those two realms, the realm that is beyond understanding and the level of understanding. When God creates the world, he does it with a system. And he starts off with that attribute of chachma, where God articulates a power that is divine, beyond understanding, and yet is the beginning of a process that connects to understanding. That's why in the world, you look at the world, there are things that we could understand, and there are things that we have to come to the conclusion are beyond our understanding. No matter how advanced we will be, right now, the 21st century, scientifically speaking, we have come so far from the 19th century. 19th century could not predict what we have today. A simple smartphone was something that I don't think a 19th century person could really conceive of. Now imagine going 10,000 years ahead, how much we will become advanced. We will never, ever fathom the true mysteries of creation. Because the true mysteries of creation lend themselves to our understanding just as they lend themselves to our not understanding them. No matter how much we understand, there's always that element that we cannot possibly fathom. And that's the message over here, that God created the world with this attribute of chachma, that though it's articulating something that has certain dimensions to it, certain approachability, you can access it, you can touch it, part of it is beyond our grasp. You cannot possibly understand it and fully grasp it. It's just one little insight that connects to chachma. Translation number 5. Based on Unclus, who says that the world was created, he says bikadmin, Hebrew Aramaic word bikadmin. Kadmin is related to a Hebrew word which is kodem. What does kodem mean? What? Before. Now rashis means the beginning. Kadmin means before the beginning. There's something beyond chachma, and that is will, God's will. Take the human being. We have various faculties. We have intellect, we have our emotions, but intellect fits into our brain. Emotions have their place where they manifest themselves. We associate emotions with the heart. But there's something that goes above and beyond our brain and our heart and our faculties, and that's called will. Willpower is not specific to any one thing. For example, if someone says, I want to study, and then the person says, I want to drink water. Now, studying is a lot more sophisticated than drinking water, but the will to drink water is no less of a will than the will to study. Will has no compartmentalization. Understanding is compartmentalized. Whatever we understand, there are different levels, different aspects of understanding. There are smarter people, less smart people, people who are more intellectual, more emotional. But will is the common denominator, is the equalizer. Are you going to say that a child's will is less than a sophisticated adult's will? No. Will is will. Will is an extension of the soul, pushing it in any one direction. I can go in 100 directions, an infinite number of directions. One direction could be intellect, another one could be emotional, a third one could be physical, and within each of these there can be multiple levels. So will is beyond even chachma, even beyond understanding. That creation comes from God's will that is B'kadmin, that comes even before wisdom. There's an aspect of God in creation that transcends even wisdom. Now, translation number 6. Sepharno. Sepharno, as you see in the sidebar, was a 16th century, 15th, 16th century sage. And his commentary is pshat, but also philosophical. And he says, Bereshis means in the beginning of time. People ask the question, why did God decide to create the world when he did? You know, if God was always around, why did he wake up now to create a world? The answer is, time is also a creation. This is hard for us to understand. When Adam was formed and he wakes up and he sees Eve and he says, Eve, what time is it now? And where were you yesterday? There was no yesterday or last week. There was no last week. Time itself is a creation. Those who say that the world always existed have to ask themselves a much stronger question. How long did it take, let's say if we say the world is, human beings are, how many, let's say 50 million years? I don't know how long do they say human beings are around? Whatever, let's say 50 million. Now for 49,997,000, we have done nothing. We have accomplished zero in terms of changing the world, harnessing the laws of nature. All of a sudden, we woke up and we became smart. Now that's being here 50 million years. But if you were here infinite years, so why are things developing the way they're developing? Couldn't they have developed this way billions of years ago, trillions of years ago, quadrillion? I mean, there's no limit. It's infinite. It's one of the arguments against the eternity of the world. That if the world is eternal, then how come things are happening at this pace? The answer is the world has a beginning. Time has a beginning. And since time began, the world is developing at quite a nice pace. What?
I was going to say that's the approach that science takes.
That? Okay. I'm delighted that we don't have an argument. In science there are different views about whether the world is always here or there was a time, the Big Bang. Yes.
That's every time, and I guess the scientific idea of entropy and the universe is expanding, and in a way our knowledge just...
Right, but if we were here, we were always here, then why are we still at the pace we are now? We should have, if everyone acknowledges, and in 10,000 years from now, we'll be a lot more advanced than we are today. But we had infinite years behind us, so why are we not that advanced already? If in 10,000 years we could reach this point, why does it take infinite years to reach it? Doesn't make any sense. Then we have translation number 7, which is from a book, a very interesting book. I'm not endorsing the book, but I'm endorsing it as a very interesting book. It's called The Bible Unauthorized. It was written in the 1940s with an attempt to translate the Bible, he only does a few chapters of it, to fit into the science of the 1940s. And, the attempt is understandable. I understand what his attempt is. I find it unnecessary to try to reconcile the Torah and science because science is constantly changing. So do we reconcile it with Aristotelian science? That's what Maimonides did in the Guide for the Perplexed. But now Aristotelian science is not considered to be science anymore. Yes?
Maimonides said Aristotelian science was wrong.
Not much of it is wrong, but he also claimed that Aristotle was the greatest mind that ever lived. Outside of Moses and the Jewish prophets, that he was as close to prophecy as you can get just by his intellectual brilliance. So Maimonides had a lot of respect for Aristotle, though he disagreed with him when it conflicted with his arguments or with Torah. But do we try to reconcile Torah with 19th century science? It would be futile because 19th century science has been debunked. 20th century science is in a constant flux. as we speak, every day, scientists are changing the theories, and they're going back and forth. So I find the exercise of trying to reconcile Torah with science to be an exercise in futility, but it's comforting to some people, because some people have this need to accept what science says, because they were brought up that way, and they also have a spiritual need to accept the Torah. So when you tell them that they're not necessarily in conflict, it makes their journey into Judaism a lot more smooth, that they don't have to confront what they think might be a real contradiction. But if someone is a believer in the Torah, they don't have a problem with science. Number one, because science is the pursuit of truth. Torah is truth. I'm not saying that we always understand Torah the way the Torah was really intended. Sometimes the Torah has to be understood differently because we misunderstood or mistranslated something. That could be. But our first default position is the Torah is truth. Science has to defend itself against the Torah, not Torah defending itself against science. But nevertheless, this book, yes?
Yeah, most non-religious Jews I know, it starts right here with Genesis. And there's an old legal saying for jury instructions that says false in one thing, false in everything. And if you catch a witness lying, you can disbelieve all their testimony. And these Jews, it starts right here. Well, the world, obviously, in their view, wasn't created in 6 literal 24-hour days. So this beginning of
We didn't even get to the 6th day. We're just barely on the beginning of the first day.
I'm just telling you what the logic is. Saying that since this portion isn't true, in their opinion, that the world has been proven not to have been created in 6 literal 24-hour days, and that part of the Torah is false, so therefore there's no reason to give any credence to any of it.
Okay.
That's where it starts.
Then we shouldn't. Then no one should vote on election day, because if you catch one candidate by one lie, then that's it. Yes.
Yeah, I had heard. I don't remember who it was attributed to. That it really says it means in principle. In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth. Meaning, the principle is there's a God, there's the creation, and there was a beginning. And that if you can accept those principles, you read on. But if you can't accept those 3 principles, there's no point in going any further.
Okay.
It won't make sense.
Yeah, if you can't accept that God is the creator, that means there's no authority and there's no point in going on. Right. But sometimes if you read on, it might inspire you to go back to the beginning. So this Bible, unauthorized, he translates it as the beginning was created. Not in the beginning God created, but God created the beginning, which fits into Sforno's interpretation that God created time, which is the beginning, because the word beginning implies time. It fits in with that, and it could fit in with a few other translations. There's one other translation I don't have down here by Rabbi Yonason Eibeshitz, a 18th century sage, who says that the word rashis means thought, that with thought God created heaven and earth. And this ties in with something we're going to be doing in subsequent weeks, translating the word for God here. The word God is not such a simple word over here, and that is going to tie in with this idea of thought, that there are 2 dimensions of creation. There's the dimension of creation with thought and the dimension of creation with speech. And this verse talks about with thought God created the heaven and earth, and then there's a dimension where God creates it with speech. But we'll have to go into that in subsequent weeks. Next week, God willing, we'll focus on the first letter, the bays of Bereshis. And then we'll get to the other words eventually.
Thank you, Rabbi. This week I studied the word late. I'll wait till next week. Goodbye. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Very, very good.